Both of my parents came from Sudan. Both of my parents lived in Khartoum, Sudan, which is the capital, and tribes are a big thing in Sudan, so everybody's kind of associated with a tribe. And mine is Denagla, so I'm a Dungulawiya. That's kind of in northern Sudan.
Here we see prehistoric populations in the central Sudan were forced out of these savannas and livable areas into the Sudanese Sahara, where rainfall and surface water was still sufficient. Up in the western desert, these people moved towards southern Egypt. David Wingrove writes about giving equal weight to empirical, observable uniformities in ritual practice, material culture, and ecology. What he's telling us here is that this evidence is empirically observable. Take these maps, for instance. These are Cooper and Copeland maps of the major occupation areas covered here. They were updated in 2008. As you can see, by 5300 BC, these people, described as Nubian related, have disappeared from the desert and new populations have now appeared near the river.
Your maternal haplogroup tells you about your maternal line ancestors from your mother to her mother and beyond. So this is my mother, LOA. And the thing that I found really cool about this haplogroup is that this existed 55,000 years ago, which is crazy. That's like ancient times, and it covers the region of Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa, which is
there is no evidence that this new population was a wave of Middle Eastern migrants that displaced these Africans. Any evidence of a German takeover of the Nile Valley or of some kind of Mesopotamian surge officially goes out the window at this point, because there is no evidence of that. After 200 years of Egyptology, it just doesn't exist. We do have evidence for is a slow motion penetration of Egypt by Semitic non-Africans. This was to pick up once dynastic history had been established. But we see that once these people arrived, they spoke Egyptian language and adopted the African way of life. Let's remember that Romuald Schild and Fred Windorf are again world-renowned anthropologists and adventurers. Not only that, Mr. Boval and Dr. Brophy have trekked into the wilderness themselves to measure and observe these things in person.
The shafts had stellar alignments. This was discovered in 1964 by Virginia Trimble and Alexandra Badawi. She is now, or was until recently, the head of the Astronomical Union.
In Black Genesis, Dr. Brophy and Mr. Boval write about Cooper here, who seems to be saying that the prehistoric black people living in the Sahara could communicate with people as far as Dongola in the Sudan, and that these same people were probably still around in the Old Kingdom when Harkuf went out to the Kingdom of Yam. Hassanin Bey certainly found some of these people, who said the prehistoric rock art in the southwestern desert was the work of their ancestors.
Nowhere in the world is as arid and as desolate as this huge desert plateau, and yet, thousands of years ago, there was once water, animals, and man. And it was here in the 1930s that the Hungarian explorer Laszlo von Almásy made a sensational discovery. But the rock pictures of the Cave of the Swimmers discovered by von Almásy are nothing compared with the abundance and sacred rituality of those to be found in this other cave. These extraordinary scenes of the life of a mysterious and long-forgotten civilization have recently been discovered. Hunting, love, games, fishing, parents holding the hands of their children. Not to mention all kinds of animals, gazelles, lions, dogs, giraffes, and a weird creature, a huge bull or elephant, headless but with a man's legs, that seems to be devouring human beings.
This has also been identified in northeastern Chad too.
Im Nordosten des Tschad, etwa von der Größe der Schweiz, rund 40.000 Quadratkilometer, was eine dreieckige Form hat und zerschnitten ist von vielen tiefen Tälern, Canyons, die zum Teil 100, 200 Meter tief sind. Und ich würde sagen, es ist wahrscheinlich der interessanteste Teil der gesamten Sahara. Und zwar deshalb, weil er praktisch ein Zeugnis ist der grünen Sahara, weil nicht in der Sahara vorkommenden Reichtum an Felsbildern und überwiegend gemalten Felsbildern erhalten sind über die Jahrtausende, die über 10.000 Jahren des Klima- und Umweltwandels und des damit verbundenen Kulturwandels und auch des ökonomischen Wandels dokumentieren. Und deswegen kann man es vielleicht kurz zusammenfassen, dass also
We also know the Sahara people could communicate and travel because the land they were living in was a giant savanna. Cooper also predicted that the Egyptians may have gone to the deepest southwest corner of Egypt, and he was proven right when physical evidence of Egyptian royalty was discovered there in 2007. The Egyptian kings knew of Jebel Uweinat and went back to this area to rendezvous with a delegation from the Kingdom of Yam, as proven by inscriptions left by the Egyptians themselves, along with the massive Egyptian water stations left in a straight line that leads directly to this location. In the Neolithic period, the people at Jebel Uweinat were also at Nabta Playa in Lower Nubia. This was accomplished by a natural trail between these areas.
Little bit of West African, which is cool. I didn't expect that.
Wouldn't that be a twist on history?
We now know that Egyptian kings did indeed go in a southwesterly direction to rendezvous with the people of Yam. These Egyptians obviously had to be in contact with these people previously to even know about this kingdom.
Now Qustul and the Horus name of Khufu, of Cheops, the builder of the Great Pyramid of Giza. You see it here? This is the Qustul of Jedefre, was the son of Cheops. Yeah? By the way, Carlo Bergman interpreted it as the first map in the world. It's very rare and it's absolutely unique. You have here the painted figure of a pharaoh in the very well-known gesture of smiting his enemies. Still some people roaming. Until recently we thought that during the Old Kingdom the desert looked already as it looked today, completely dry. But because of what we see in this area here, we think that there's still some people were living here, roaming here, maybe some goat and sheep herders or whatever, that there was still some vegetation in the area that supported this pastoral life.
And to set up the rendezvous point. I can see you nodding your head right now. This is a consideration that not even a Eurocentric can deny. This is an example of evidence that can be clearly demonstrated and has been demonstrated by world-renowned professionals. It can also be observed by any person brave enough to go to these locations. I've included this handy roadmap for the discerning Eurocentric. Bruce Williams tells us here that in the formative years of Egyptian civilization, the Neolithic of Sudanese tradition strongly influenced what was going on in Upper Egypt, a reoccurring theme that we hear over and over again. He states clearly that pharaonic institutions amongst the A group were established in Nubia.
So basically, I'm every type of African.
He writes that the Siali seal of Nagata II shows that the A group dynasty in Lower Nubia began before the unification of Upper Egypt, because separate evidence of individual royal Egyptian burials continued later at Egyptian Cemetery CT and at Heracleopolis.
Always. They're not new. That's my whole
This
point.
all goes hand in hand with what the UNESCO Courier stated in 1980. Painted pottery vessels from the Nubian Cemetery L features a bird attacking an oval that contains two diagonal lines, which is the symbol for Heracleopolis. If this indeed does record an actual historical event, what this physical evidence tells us is an A group Nubian pharaoh attacked Heracleopolis over there in Upper Egypt.
Wouldn't that be a twist on history?
Upper Egypt wasn't even a military power yet, and it was still divided, so this was entirely possible. The decorations from this Nubian bowl features a vulture attacking pre-dynastic Upper Egypt. When we open our ancient Egypt coffee table books, the pages covering the earliest years of Egypt will never tell you this information, but we see it right here for ourselves. What we may have here indeed is the true origins of Egypt's early conflicts with these peoples south of Aswan. Bruce Williams says that the Nubian pre-dynastic world tombs were the same size as Egyptian tombs, and the wealth in these tombs was generally comparable to Egypt's earliest world tombs, and this is reinforced by the large tombs at Cemetery V. He goes on to say that the hierarchy of these tombs shows that the A-Greek Nubians of the pre-dynastic period have shown us that they developed a class system that supported a ruler whose power extended from the southern end of the Second Cataract to north of Aswan, along with both directions into the desert. Cemetery S was a complex of 12 pre-dynastic Nubian kings, and that's what they were. Mr. Williams tells us that they were by far the richest tombs in all of Nubia, without peers or even reasonably close competitors. And look what it says here. The tombs represented a supremacy. Nowhere in contemporary Europe is anything described even close to this glorious.
Basically, I'm East African and a little bit of West African, which is cool. I didn't expect that.
And this is why they punish the Nubians every single day, because this constitutes a physically verifiable pre-dynastic Nubian Pharaonic dynasty. So, Eurocentrics refuse to acknowledge this incredible information for what it is and vaguely refer to them as chiefs. All because the Europeans had no kings. Let's face it and let's be real. But the proof is in the pudding. The UNESCO Courier tells us here that these Nubian tombs featured antiquities that were so numerous, varied, and of such high quality, including some that were entirely unique, that had these tombs been found in a pre-dynastic cemetery further north or of a much later date, they would have been considered royal at once. And this is true. If 12 incredible and rich tombs were found in Central Europe featuring pharaonic imagery, entirely unique items of high quality, and was in daily contact with Egypt, every Eurocentric would explode in orgasmic bliss.
Caucasian,
Black,
Caucasian,
African.
$8,000 years ago. The grinding stone was lying here, and so they left it, and she hoped that she could come back. But then the desert came, it waited too dry, she could not return. And now tourists come, and look what they have done. Collected, took the grinding stones from here and there. And that is what we archaeologists have to fight against. That is a problem, it's one of the main targets of our tour here. That we prevent tourists from doing so as we see it here. Because we want to know how prehistoric people lived, how they behaved in their side.
They're not new. That's my whole point.
Nothing at this level has ever been found in Western Europe, and I don't mean some chief buried with his horses and gold either. Let's remember that the white crown and the falcon represent a supremacy that was
Nomos points out in 30 AD also point out the Egyptian priests mocked the Greeks because on many things they have never known the truth. What seemed to be clear is that the Egyptian priests were regarded by the Greeks as the keepers of great astronomical wisdom. In the days of the 4th dynasty, the primitive Greeks would have appeared as barbarians and other Europeans as no more than cavemen by the sophisticated and technologically advanced Egyptians who built the pyramids. So here, that's why brothers still want to be a Greek, brand themselves, because we think that's the beginning.
By the pre-dynastic period in Egypt, what had once been widespread groups of people with clearly demonstrated cultural affinities was now displaying clear cultural differentiation and independence. This brings us back to David Wingworld, who writes here what actually was shared throughout the Nile Valley was materials and practices, especially modes of ritual practice. And out of this came local contrast, where we start to see group identities being constructed. This is what I identified last year as regional variation. When did this differentiation between Nubians and Egyptians take place? First, we need to establish that prior to the appearance of either Nagata or A group, there was no such thing as Egyptian or A group culture. Both of these things diverged from a pre-existing. This explains why Williams wrote that in Nagata stage 1A, Nubian and Nagata materials were indistinguishable from each other. But it's at stage 1B, about 100 years later, that we start to see A group pottery first take on its very own distinct characteristic.
Always. They're not new. That's my whole point.
This early A group is dated from Nagata 1B to 2C. And this is yet another confirmation of what has been demonstrated by these academics clearly. A shared and proven material culture in this area that sees two different divergences at around the same time. Maria Gatto wrote only a few years ago that the process of cultural mixing in the area of Aswan in the pre-dynastic is clearly detectable in the material culture and much more complex and multidimensional than previously thought. Maria observes here that the fast spread of what was now an Egyptian material culture can hardly be interpreted as the result of migration, colonization, or domination. And this is true. Once again, this completely shuts down European dreams of a Caucasian takeover in Northeast Africa. Have a seat now. She nails it definitively here when she says, as previously stated, it is highly unlikely that the arrival of Nagata means migration of people from the north, colonization, or domination of the local community.
You have some authority to speak on what you're saying. Okay, but as far as the civilization that we recognize as the Pharaonic civilization in Egypt, did this civilization, is it one that originated in the north or in the south?
No, it originated actually in the south and in Nubia before in Egypt. The Nubian civilization was older than the ancient Egyptian civilization. Nubia before in Egypt, Nubia before in Egypt, the Nubian civilization was older than the ancient Egyptian civilization. It was older than the ancient Egyptian civilization. As archaeologists were excavating in Nubia, they found pottery and some artifacts that predate the ancient Egyptian civilization. And also the civilization that the Egyptian civilization actually started in the south. The Egyptian civilization actually started in the south before the north. That's why always when you look at the Egyptian inscriptions, you will see the symbol referring to the north is written before the symbol referring to the south is written before the symbol of the north, which means that the south comes first. The south comes first. The south comes first. The south comes first.
Yes. So then we would say that what we recognize as the Pharaonic civilization came out of these people in the south from lower Nubia and upper Egypt.
These kings were known as the mythical followers of Horus to the later Egyptian kings. We need to remember that the very earliest parts of Nagata were indistinguishable from what became the A group later. This is very specific. So, what we have is a pre-existing technoplex that splinters each in its own direction, yet each is still Nubian related anyway. Once this matured, within a few hundred years, we see Egyptian culture emerging and we see A group culture emerging, when neither culture had existed before, because the factors creating these entities, such as the movements from the western desert and the emergence of world principalities and social stratification over those principalities, hadn't emerged yet. This reminds us of the words of Diodorus, who later tells us the Egyptians were Ethiopian colonists, or Herodotus, who tells us the Nubians were the first amongst all men. Maria says here in Cultural Entanglement that as these identities developed and matured, there always remained an identifiable Nubian component in many aspects of the material culture moving forward. And I'd like to add, going the other way, we see many Egyptian components with the Nubians. This is what she means by cultural entanglement. This is a period of developing identities. We can see now that this is not all as simplistic as the Eurocentrics have made it out to be. They keep it simplistic so they can lie a little bit more easily. Maria tells us here what we've already known for years, that the Nubian tradition was the one settled in the area before the arrival of the Egyptian one. The strong presence of Nubian objects engraved suggests a willingness by the locals to keep their identity mainly in the funerary sphere. So what we see here is physical evidence of people adopting and developing new ways while holding on to the old ways in certain aspects. She uses the New Kingdom as an example. Egyptianized Nubians would live essentially as Egyptians, but would still keep Nubian burial practices mainly amongst the women. This is how we see alike Nubian burials in Egypt, and many of these people were living in Egypt not as Nubians but as Egyptians, yet were buried as Nubians in Egypt.
The view from the top to the other pyramid, it was really amazing. Actually, I can't describe it in words because when I reached the top, it was really unbelievable for me.
Moving forward, we see examples of this cultural transformation with hybrid objects such as Nagata red polish bowls that feature Nubian decorations, and this is another example of cultural entanglement. Maria Gatto is a true pre-dynastic expert, and she shows us here that Egypt and Nubia were culturally entangled with the addition of new elements, which would have been these new and shifting identities. She tells us right here that the different stages at the base of all this entanglement we've been talking about has been detected. So anyone that tells you we'll never know, that it's some kind of grand mystery, is simply trying to keep things ambiguous so they can find yet another way to insert a magical Caucasian into places that don't exist. But thanks to excellent academics like Maria Gatto, what we do see existing is coexisting cultural identity markers being acknowledged by Egyptians and Nubians, and appropriation and elaboration of specific elements. This all leads up to materially entangled identity forms being created. So, why did this identity need to be created?
This is the source of the Nile. It's about 6 p.m. Uganda time. We're taking a nice cool boat ride to the source, the actual source.
Maria nails it on the head here when she says that the growth of the elite system in Egypt during the 4th millennium created a strong centralized control, with the need for a more consistent presence of Nagata symbolism, ideology, and iconography on the ground, which then becomes a standard in the material culture in its own right. This is followed by full cultural independence, as exhibited by the almost disappearance of Nubian markers from the material record. Here we observe that the oldest representations of Egyptian royal iconography are to be found in the south at Aswan, as observed by Maria Gatto. This is what current research brings us. Even more.
The south comes first. The south comes first.
That is, until it's time for these Africans to go to Lower Egypt and dominate it for themselves. Why did this Egyptian identity distinguish itself? Instead of sharing elements, as has been demonstrated here, we now have an independent Egyptian identity that can be identified as Egyptian now. Whereas earlier this was indistinguishable from Nubian activity, As stated by the Grand Masters who have observed this material for themselves, the same can be said for the A group, who within 100 years of this development had also finished distinguishing themselves as an original cultural unit. Maria points out that in the 5th millennium, this distinction between Egyptians and Nubians would have made no sense because Middle and Upper Egypt had strong ties to Nubian and Nilotic pastoral traditions, which was proven by her only a few years ago through the examination of similar potteries, economies, and settlement patterns surrounding the entire Nile Valley, which itself goes hand in hand with everything else stated here so far. We can finish this by taking a look at Maria's conclusion, published in 2014, not 1914. The creation of the Egyptian identity was instrumental for the justification of political power and had as a consequence the creation of the ancient Egyptian concept. This idea of us versus them was to become very multi-dimensional because non-Egyptian Asiatics came into Egypt from the north and became Egyptians, and Nubian princes such as Hekenefer were raised in the palace alongside the royal children as Egyptians. And even as far back as the pre-dynastic, we see in the oldest Egyptian royal rock art a circumcised Nubian participating in a royal Egyptian jubilee alongside the original followers of Horus, the earliest mythical Egyptian kings. This Nubian is not an enemy, but a member of the elite, as observed and recorded by Ms. Gatto.
Always. They're not new. That's my whole point.
This is yet another slap in the face to Western European descended Egypt groupies, who wish it was them being featured alongside the mythical followers of Horus. But this is the ancient glory of Africa, and it belongs to all of us. As demonstrated by Wingrove when he says that Egypt's early development is firmly tied to Nubia, and also as observed by Gatto when she tells us that not only was Wingrove right, but that Nubia was in fact the African ancestor of Egypt and Africa's pastoral tradition, which itself ties into the kingships of Africa. Wingrove told us that this has been known for years, so I guess like Dr. Sally Ann Ashton had to write a paper for the Eurocentrists called Curating Kemet, Fear of a Black Land.
Well, they need to rewrite the textbooks on this. It's right there in the Nubian or Ta-Nehisian Museum. And what? Here, validating what? Wadi Halfa going back 65,000 to 55,000 years ago.
LOA. And the thing that I found really cool about this haplogroup is that this existed 55,000 years ago, which is crazy. That's like ancient times, and it covers the region of Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa, which is pretty broad.
Now that this has all become clear to us, there is no need for Atlantis theories or Sumerian migrations anymore. In every discipline, all we see is Nubians, which explains the constant envy and punishments of these people in the never-ending parade of Arabian DNA tests. Ancient Kemet is the home of the civilizers of the known Western powers in the world today. They know this, and it explains why a Nubian pyramid is only American money, followed secondly by the Horus family. And it gets deeper, folks. Brand new research and 200 years of study have brought us to this point, much to the dismay of the Eurocritics, who will only concoct more excuses to deny African glory. But they won't take it this time. Bruce Williams says that the participation in dynastic culture by these Nubians should come as no surprise, since Nubia and Egypt were not only, once again, deeply intertwined, they also both belong to the Great East African substratum. Here we see the same thing repeated over and over, yet for some bizarre reason, the Eurocentrics are always celebrating imaginary victories after they worked on their new Iris Egyptian theory. In the meantime, these people are sweating under their Eurocentric collars, hoping that somebody like me won't organize this information and disseminate it like I'm doing right now. This information presented today is usually presented in many separate pieces in time and space, but never pieced together into a single piece. This all leads us into the mysteries of nabta playa. Join me next time as we take a look at what this has to do